Me too.
God.
With you, Scott, crowing about yourself always bleeds into making fun of yourself.
And we're
It's
live.
often hard to tell the difference.
Oh boy. And
Me
we're
too.
live. It's Wednesday, September 8th, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time.
You forgot the year.
Wait, 2021.
Good.
And and we're not allowed to have fun anymore. But before we have our wonderful guest, Dominic Packer, to talk about his new book with Jay Van Bavel, we're going to have a monologue a commentary from Scott, and then personal news from Scott. And then Ben has a short monologue.
You think I should tell everyone?
Wait, yeah. What was your personal news?
Okay. I'll tell everyone. I'm not sure.
Scott, in a text message before the show, I have some personal news to share on the show.
Well, so I've had, like for the last while, all these emails that I haven't responded to, and it's been really preying on me. Has that ever happened with you?
No.
You just.
It doesn't prey on me, but yes.
It doesn't. And then every day you feel like you're going to do it and you never do it. And then you're like, I'm going to sit down and do it. Today was the day that I sat down, I did it. And I have a clean email conscience. So basically, if you haven't.
So everybody send Scott emails, bombard him with emails so that he will get back into the hole, because he doesn't really deserve to have a clean email
That's
conscience.
Scott.shapiro@yale.edu.
Yeah. Hit him now. Hit him hard.
I feel pure. I feel pure. I feel also slightly better than everyone else because I have responded, or maybe I feel like
Did you actually answer them, or you deleted them?
That's a HIPAA violation, and you may not ask that on this show. Sorry.
My apologies.
Yeah, it's okay. People are sloppy when it comes to HIPAA, but we're quite strict. Okay. Anyway, that was my news.
Oh, it's pretty great though. That's actually I totally get that. Ben.
All right. So I, as you all know, we have been. We had to decide when to celebrate the 500th episode, and we decided to celebrate the 500th episode over the course of 5 episodes, in part to give ourselves a grace period in case we had misnumbered anything over the 500 roughly episodes of In Lieu of Fun. Now, for reasons that you may not have appreciated, I have had cause to do a bit of an audit of not all of our enumerations of In Lieu of Fun episodes, but the first 50 or so. And the reason is that I have been every day or every couple of days posting one of the back episodes to our podcast feed because several of you seem to like the audio versions of these things, and so it may be news to some of you. We don't have a large staff here, so I actually do it myself. And along the way, I have been checking how has our enumeration been. And so this is in my role as the Inspector General of In Lieu of Fun, that, is the. For example, we claim that today is episode 503, but is it really? So I regret to inform you that there are some errors in the first 50 enumerations of episodes of In Lieu of Fun. And I just want to share the interim findings with you. So I'm going to share my screen here. And what you'll see is that
this is going to throw off all our models.
Exactly. It's actually a real problem that this has happened. So what you're going to see is that the first one, which is In Lieu of Fun test, doesn't have any problems, right? And then YouTube conveniently does things in rows of 5. So you should just be able to like scan the left-hand thing and say 5, 10, 15. Looks pretty good so far. 20, 26. Whoops, there's a problem. All right, so the problem here is that we skipped episode 21. But fortunately, we redid episode 28. So that kind of cancels itself out, and we're back on track by episode 30. But here's where things get to be a problem. Okay, we're fine on episode 35. We're really good on episode 40. But then look what happens, and this is what happens when I posted the episode this week.
We should have David Plotz back. Sorry,
we go from episode 40 to 41 to 43, and then we stay at episode 43 for 3 episodes, ending that group of 5 at episode 44. And so what you'll see is that by the end of our 50th episode, we are only at episode 49 because we have 3 episode 43s.
And then you skipped early, and then you skipped earlier, right? So,
well, we skipped episode 21, but we repeated episode 28. So we kind of made those 2 errors canceled each other out. But it turns out if you repeat episode 43 twice, so you have 3 episode 43s, and you don't compensate for it by having, say, no episode 47, 48, and 49, you throw things off by episode 50. So I just want to fully disclose
I want everyone to know that you were in charge of this until
I was totally in charge of this.
This is what happens or something.
This is what happens when you have morons running on your show. So I just, I feel like, it may be a HIPAA violation, but since I'm doing it to myself, I have the right to disclose my medical information.
I don't know about that, but go ahead.
Speaking of medical information, that episode with Will DeWitt, my friend, who's was the doctor who was working on COVID patients, he says that all of his patients now come in and have watched that episode because they Google his name and it's the first thing that comes up. And so he's like, great, this is fantastic.
So anyway, I just want to say, this is episode 503, give or take. And I think we should add a give or take, plus or minus, in or around, on or about, as we would say in court filings. So I think we should just have that as a give a margin of error when we discuss our episode numbers.
Can we just have 2 different calendars, like the Julian and Gregorian?
Yeah. Or
solar.
We can have
lunar solar. You're right, exactly.
The sort of Jewish versus Islamic approach. We could correct for it, like having the second month of Adar, like the Jewish calendar does, or we could never correct for it, like the Muslim calendar does.
We just corrected for it with 5 episodes of
and
500.
Just get further and further off the actual solar calendar.
But as Kate points out, though, we intentionally did this to ourselves by having.
But that assumes we have had too few episodes, whereas doing episode 43 over and over again, what if we made the problem worse by having 5 episodes?
I have no idea where we are right now. Maybe we should hire someone to count it for us.
Anyway, the audit will continue. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. We are also not allowed to have an accurate count of in lieu of fun. But we are allowed to have Dominic Packer join us. Kate, introduce our guest.
Dominic Packer. It's so nice to have you on. Dominic is a psychology professor at Lehigh the Lehigh University, where my dad went to college, actually, and where Scott's sister went to college. Also, I'll just like add, we were bits and we were talking about before the show. And he is the author of The Power of Us with J. Van Bavel, which is this. I actually would just like love for you to describe the book. You gave me a description in the email that you sent. And I haven't gotten a chance to read it. It is ordered, but I'm excited for it. I mean, like, no, you don't understand. So I don't know if you know, do you know that I have a psychology, like my background is in cognitive psych.
I do,
So
yeah.
like,
Cognitive science,
yeah. So I love this stuff. And I'm very excited to talk about this with you today. Thank you so much for coming on. Also, I will note that, are you Canadian?
I am Canadian.
We love Canadian.
Jay is Canadian as well.
I love Canadians. I'm a Canadian.
That's great to hear. Awesome. I will say I actually have filed my paperwork to become a U.S. citizen.
Congratulations.
We love Canadian turncoats.
I'm hoping to keep both. Play both sides is my goal.
So before we get into the book though, Dominic, can we talk a little bit about kind of like you and what you study and kind of how you got there? It looks like you were at McGill and UT. So
yeah, well, first I just wanted to say it is a real thrill. We're doing all book promotion this week, but this is the thing I've been looking forward to the most, honestly.
Because you get to drink with us.
Lurker.
Oh,
I got to drink with you in my university office, and but I've been lurking in the YouTube side of In Lieu of Fun for a long time, mainly because it's the end of the day and I'm like wrangling my kids, and I'm usually listening, not watching. But so Crowdcast hasn't worked out. But I think I was trying to figure out what the first episode I caught was, and I think it was around this time last year with Katie Lieu. When she was talking about white supremacy in her book. Pretty sure that was the first episode. In any case, so it's a real thrill to be here.
Yeah.
Well, it's great. With any luck, we won't have any tech problems with you.
Yeah.
We'll see how that goes. So yeah, I'm a social psychologist. I went to McGill, University of Montreal, and then I went to grad school at Toronto, where I met my office mate, Jay. We didn't like each other very much at first. He's very eager, and I was a year ahead, so it was just too much. He also tried to store his hockey equipment in our shared office, which smelled really
fucking Canadian. That is such
right. That's like right, exactly. That's like every Canadian sitcom.
Yeah, exactly. But in Canada, that's a faux pas, I have to say. Hockey equipment shared office, no good.
That's what makes it great comedic material.
That's right. Followed by further comedic material, which we actually opened the book with. We became close a few months later when we went to a departmental wine and cheese, which was filled with academics, and there'd been some illustrious speaker, and we're young grad students and the lowest of the low, really. And Jay choked on a piece of cheese at the wine and cheese, and I ended up saving his life. It was cheese night, yeah.
Wait, did you
Oh my God.
you actually save his life?
I actually gave him the Heimlich at the wine and cheese.
How all good co-author relationships start.
Yeah.
With vomiting and the Heimlich maneuver.
Yeah, wow, that's an awesome story, because
that's how Kate and I met too.
But not only that, but as having been a grad student, I can just say that if there's nothing more mortifying than choking,
it was mortifying. This speaks to our personalities. So Jay.
So wait. But before you go on, we gotta focus on this aspect. Because
interrogate.
So. Is this a power move that, like, he's not here, you are, so you tell this story?
No, you just said it was in the introduction of the book.
Okay, so, like, if he were here, would he tell this story? Or is that, like, is this, like...
Slightly differently. Slightly different, but same story.
In his version, do you choke and he does the
No, in his version, he's less greedy, though. So what happens next is
was he like housing the cheese?
So he was, yeah. And
after he just come from hockey practice.
He wanted to go back. he wanted to go back and eat more. And I was so horrified, I had to go home. Like, I can't watch you eat cheese.
I can't watch you do this to yourself again, Jay.
Exactly.
This is like every Canadian buddy movie.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, totally. We've continued to have food adventures or misadventures. So I've observed him eat a raw sausage by mistake. I've seen him eat raw chicken in Times Square by mistake.
Wait, raw chicken in Times Square? Like, why? How? What? Like, where was it completely raw or just mostly raw?
It was raw. So
I just want to say that I've been to a lot of conferences and raw chicken has not been served.
Dominic, you're surpassing. I mean, I really want to talk about your book, but so far, like, this is
just see how long we can keep the subject on choking on raw chicken before we get to your book.
The research is super boring relative to this. So, yeah, we were at this conference. We had a symposium we were both presenting at. I think we were both assistant professors by this point, but still junior, and nobody knows who we are. And so, and the symposium was about moral disgust, which we'd done some work on. And
Nia Stroman's we had like area,
right? Totally, yeah. I love her work. So, after we had about an hour and a half before the symposium, so we decided to go to a themed restaurant in Times Square. I won't say which one, but it was super dark, and we were really engaged in our conversation. And Jay ordered some sort of salad with supposed to be grilled chicken on it, but we're talking and it's dark, and he starts eating, and about halfway in, he realizes there's something odd about this chicken. So he shines his phone flashlight on it and realizes it's completely raw. Like, I don't think it had touched the grill. So, I mean, we're disgusted.
Why would you realize that, like, literally the second it touched your mouth? Yeah, like, it feels so different.
I'm suddenly feeling like I have a much more sophisticated palate than I imagined.
It'll take you more than 3 bites.
Right, exactly.
I think I would get it in the dark.
I think I'd get it right away. Yeah.
But that's
so. I'm not gonna. Yeah, Jay may have a counter narrative I see on the chat. That's a valid point, but he ate a bunch of it though. So we call the waiter over, and he gets the manager, and this is the best part. We said he offers to have it cooked.
Better than okay.
They offer to cook it.
The guy says,
"Well, do you?"
Said, I think that's fine, but if you want us to cook it more, I think he said more. We'll do that. And Jay's like, no, this is disgusting. What are you going to do about it? And the guy says, literally, he says, well, we'll take half the price off the bill. And we're like, what? And he said, well, you already ate half of it.
I just want to say that this sounds like you guys got like punked. I don't know, to be at a conference about disgust and then to like have something like that happen.
Oh yeah.
And then to like have like a weird moral challenge of like, do I pay for this?
No, that you weren't punked. You guys were the experiment.
Yeah.
But I want to understand
your colleagues were thinking like
between the raw chicken and the book. So like okay, so you bond over
tissue.
not.
I get it.
Yeah, you see what I did there?
Gross.
You bond over the, hockey equipment, not liking each other, Heimlich maneuver. There's some raw chicken in Times Square where somebody was playing, let's see what we can get the Canadians to eat and pay for. And then somehow there's a book.
They're so nice. They're so nice.
They're so nice. They'll even pay for the raw chicken we made to me.
Half of it.
Yeah, half of it. So how did you get from there to what the book's about?
Well, so along the way, we did a little bit of research together. So starting in grad school, we started studying social identities. So the way people define themselves in terms of the groups that they belong to, and the implications that has for all kinds of behaviors and perception and decision making. So we started in grad school by studying really discriminatory behavior or, bias of various kinds. We did implicit bias work. We did work with fMRI, looking at brain responses, how people react to the faces of the members of different groups, in group and out group. And then over time, it's morphed into all sorts of directions. And to get to the sort of premise of the book, what we're interested in is how human identity is a multifaceted thing. So we have multiple selves, right? There's aspects of ourself that are deeply personal and individual. There's relational selves, which is you in relationship to specific others, like you're a parent or a child or a professor or student. And then there's the groups we belong to, which for many of us become deeply important, including like being a member of, say, the Lieu community or the Greek chorus, right? These identities start to really matter to people. And that has a bunch of consequences. And in particular, different identities, the same person has multiple identities, and as different identities come in that are focus for them, it changes their perceptions, it changes their preferences, their goals, it changes who's in and who's out. And so the same person can go through the course of a day and actually behave quite differently without necessarily even realizing it, simply because different identities are coming online at different points in time. So fundamentally, that's the book. And we sort of go from perceptual effects. So Jay in particular has done studies on these can even affect taste and smell, not the taste of chicken apparently, but taste and smell, so some pretty basic things, all the way up through mobilizing large groups of people for social change and revolution. All of it hinges at some level on identities, especially identities founded in the groups we belong to.
So can we talk a little bit about how you're defining identity? Because like if it's self-defined, I feel like that's I mean, I think you could, I think that there's just like an infinite amount of, it seems like a very hard thing to bound, so to speak, like just the idea of identity.
Yeah, so we treat it generally as someone holds an identity if it's some aspect of the self that they place value on. Because there's certainly things about ourselves that we may not, so we all belong to social categories, for example, that we may not necessarily value, or that's not an important part of who we are. So, people don't necessarily categorize themselves that much on their hair color, for example. You could divide up the world that way. You could make it a central part of who you are, that I'm a brunette or I'm a, Asian redhead. But most of us don't make that a central identity, though you could, right? Like Anne of Green Gables, it was central Canadian heroine. But so generally that's how we think about it, is it's some social, in the case of a social identity, it's a social category membership you have, but that for one reason or another, it's important to you. Either because you're personally putting value into it, or in some cases because it's largely unavoidable. Like other people are so prone to treat you as a member of that category that you're sort of potentially stuck with it, whether you like it or not.
Okay, but all of that seems very relational. Like your hair color example is like a really is like one perfect example. It's like if you wouldn't think of your value as like a redhead if you live in a society that's full of redheads, and then all of a sudden you go to college and all of a sudden you meet people that don't have red hair and you're the only one, and don't value it until that moment. And there's tons of things that lurk in our personality like that. Like I don't think of myself as particularly good at baseball, but if I met a bunch of Canadians, I'd be like, hey, I'm so much better at baseball than you. So like kind of like part of it seems to me to also, I mean, and I don't know how you design the studies, like part of it seems to have kind of like the self-reporting bias that's inherent in like any type of kind of like, if you're identifying something as yourself, it's already something that you think of as important and thus probably have like publicized or said out loud in some type of way or like shared with the community.
Yeah. Well, so I think you're making great points. So first of all, you're 100% right that the things we tend to think of ourselves in terms of are often the things that make us distinct in one way or another, right? And there's classic social psychology studies on this from like the 50s, where they looked at, for example, female children's identity, and they were much more likely to see themselves as girls if they were in a classroom that was mostly boys, but less likely to think of themselves as girls if they were in a classroom where there were plenty of other girls, because it didn't differentiate them. And this is part of that multiple selves issue, that like at different points of our lives, or even in the same day, different situations you're in, different identities will come to the fore because of that kind of dynamic. That if you find yourself suddenly the only representative of a group and everyone's sort of looking at you like that, then that's going to be part of your identity in that moment, even though it might not ordinarily be, right? Or it wasn't 20 minutes before in a different context. So that's totally right. And then methodologically, we employ multiple methods to try to look at people's identities. So sometimes there are groups that people belong to and we're measuring it. So there's questionnaires we ask: how identified are you with this category? How important is it to you? How often do you think about yourself as a member of this group? And that tends to actually predict quite a bit. But there are other times when, for a variety of reasons, we want to strip away a lot of the baggage that comes with real life groups of one form or another. And so we create groups in the lab, which is actually incredibly easy to do, shockingly easy to do.
What is an example of
talk about this
creating a group in a lab?
Yeah, so in the book, we talk about these studies.
Did you make some of them prisoners and some of them guards? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry.
Well, we do talk about that study too, and I'd love to revisit that one. But so we talk about these studies from the 1970s, which I personally think are the most important, among the most important psychological studies ever conducted, but they're much less well known than the prisoners and the guards, for example. And they're called the minimal group studies. And so this was done in the UK, and the researchers were interested in trying to study prejudice and discrimination, but recognize that if you take real life groups like Protestants and Catholics, or white people and black people, or there's so much going on there, right? There's long histories, and there's stereotypes, and there's conflict potentially over resources, and there's, you know, histories of violence, and there's all these factors, and it's really hard to get a handle on what's doing what. So they wanted to create a situation where they'd strip all that out, like create basically a social vacuum, and then you can slowly add stuff back in experimentally. We'll add a stereotype, or we'll add conflict over a resource, and see what happens. And so they came up with this paradigm where you're creating what they called minimal groups, which is they're in a category, but there's like no meaning attached to it, and there's no reason you should have any preference for your category over any other. And literally, you can do this by flipping a coin, in which they did. So you more or less randomly assign people to say you're on team A or team B, or you're a lion or a tiger, which are two groups that Jay and I have used a lot. You never meet anyone in either group. So there's no personal relationships. You've never heard of them before. They're not going to last more than about 15 minutes in the lab. And then they give you tasks to say divide up resources between your own group and the other group. And what they find, and we still find very consistently, is it doesn't get rid of bias, that people immediately resonate to the team they've been put on, even if they know it's random. They're like, I'm a lion, awesome. Lions are the best. And given a choice to divide up resources like money, they'll give more to the lions, even with no personal benefit, which is important. They get nothing personally out of it, but they'll give more to their own team members than they will to the outgroup.
Okay, so how?
So we've done, yeah.
Because this strikes me. Have you seen Derek DelGaudio's monologue in and of itself? So this is, I've been trying to get him on the show, but mysteriously he does not respond to my incessant tweeting at him. I do think members of the Greek chorus, you should all tweet at Derek DelGaudio that he should come on in lieu of fun. But that's neither here nor there. He did a incredible monologue, which he performed 500-600 times in New York, and was eventually made into a movie that was an amalgamation of the performances of it. And he's it's basically about individual identities that people assume, and the various identities that he's had at different times in his life. I'm interested in the difference between individual identities. I'm a hacker, or I'm a inclusive legal positivist, or I'm a I'm a, something that doesn't really identify you particularly with a group or community of people. It rather identifies you very individually in terms of what you do or how you think, or with the kind of group identity that you're talking about. I'm a brewer, meaning that describes not that I'm part of a community of people who brew beer, but it describes actually how I spend my time, right? I am not a brewer. It seems to me there's one kind of identity that is group identity, and that there's another kind of identity that's highly individualized, and that's just the persona that we adopt. And I'm curious whether how these differ from one another, and how we wear many different of them at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So undoubtedly we have identities of both kinds. There's things, even if they are sort of categories, but when we say we are a brewer or whatever, it really is, I'm talking about myself and my hobby, or how I spend my time. And it differentiates me from other individuals I know, like in my social network, say. And that's different than someone who could say the same thing, I'm a brewer, and identify with it as a group of people. And there's various tip-offs as to what kind of identity it is. So for the person that's an individual, they don't really care about what other brewers do per se, right? And if brewers get a bad name in the press because there's some sort of brewing incident, doesn't really, they're not going to feel shame or concern about it. They're not going to be motivated necessarily to defend the community. That's very different than the person who, it is a community and they feel threatened when it's threatened, and they're motivated to defend other members of it. And maybe they want to become a leader. Like, I'd like to take charge of the brewing community. Like, the individual's not going to do that, but the group member might. And
that's
so,
like Scott and the inclusive legal positivists.
Exactly.
No,
So
he hates the inclusive legal positivists. He's against them.
Yeah, vehemently.
But what we find generally is people are very quick to take the collective type. That sort of surprisingly, we often think of it as individual, and then you find yourself in a situation you actually do get defensive about the group, even though you thought it was just a you thing.
May I? Can I jump in? I feel like maybe it's not like even a group thing. It's like a cooperation thing. Like, so it's like, it's not that I think of myself, oh, a lion, but I have a commitment to people with whom I'm going to cooperate, that we're going to act in a fair way towards one another, which means favoring. Of course, that's what cooperative relationships are, is they're partially exclusionary. So I wonder if that makes sense.
So that's actually very similar to how I think about it. I'm not sure every social psychologist would agree actually with that, but I tend to think that the reason we do this sort of distally, like why we might have evolved to have this propensity to resonate even with a novel team you've never heard of before, is it's like a readiness to cooperate. It's like we're looking for opportunities to ally ourselves with people, and when they come along, we're eager to seize on them and just see what happens. But proximally, in terms of like the psychology of it, what it feels like, it tends to feel like positive emotion and feelings of attraction or feelings of trust. So there's a sort of duality to it of like, it serves the purpose of cooperation, but it also comes along with this sort of psychology of, I like us and I want to be part of us and I feel connected to you.
Well, can I just push back a little bit? This reminds me of like color war at camp. I don't know if you ever like went to you were ever subjected to this horrible
I was just
institution.
thinking about that. Terrible institution. And to this day, if you say reds and blues, I have a side in that.
Right. So
I'm a blue, and I've always been a blue.
Right. So but there really is that sense that like you couldn't extend that past 3-4 days. Like it's like a thing. It's like a very limited thing, because after a while it wouldn't bleed into your real life. It's relatively autonomous, because you would start thinking, there's no real difference between Reds and Blues or Lions and Tigers in this way. So I just wonder if it's our ability to simulate.
But people do it with sports teams all the time, and they do extend it beyond. I mean, I had lunch.
Not really. Really?
No, I had lunch the other day with somebody who will die on the hill of being a Yankees fan. And she is this is a part of her identity. And she knows it's inconsequential and unimportant, and yet that doesn't make her feel it any less.
My dad used to have a saying that I was never allowed to date a Yankees fan. He was a Red Sox fan.
Right.
But he would I remember him would be just driving in the car and there'd just be a moment and he'd be of quiet, and out of nowhere he'd just be do you ever think that Yankees fans are just morally unfit to live in society? And I was
Right.
And have you ever dated a Yankees fan?
I don't know. No, I don't think so, actually.
See?
Yeah, I know. No, it's true. It's kind of so anyway, so this is, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dominic, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I was just going to say, to Scott's point, I think I would say we have a readiness for it. And if it doesn't manifest in something useful, then it's not going to sustain itself. But let's say you do group yourself as a tiger, and the tigers come together and they start to develop norms and they start to develop a legal system of sorts, right? Then there's utility there and it's going to persist. And they become interested in not letting the lions in because they would disrupt it, or they have different norms, or they don't abide by our rules. And it can very quickly, I think, actually become quite rigid.
Could it be that the social meaning of identity is one of analogy? And that Reds and Blues is basically an analogy to that, it puts you in the context of who the person is vis-a-vis everyone else, and you know how to sort them and know how to categorize them, and then as the game declines or ends or whatever, that stops being a salient kind of factor for categorization. Sorry, I'm touching back my salience categories with Tversky there, but
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we're ready to group the world, and then we're looking to see, is this was that grouping diagnostic of how the world really works? And often it is, because we create the reality around us, but other things can undermine it. And so there's a classic study, which you've probably heard of, called the Robbers Cave experiment, where they took two groups of young schoolboys, aged 11, and divided them into two groups. And then they developed this serious rivalry with food fights and vandalism. And then they reduced the rivalry and sort of created social cohesion by creating what they call the superordinate goal. So there were things that only by working together, these two groups of boys could achieve. And without achieving it, they couldn't eat because the food truck was stuck in the mud. There's all sorts of stuff going on. But with those common goals, they formed sort of a new identity, which was a more superordinate collective. And the other day, I was listening to the show and you were talking about what happened after 9/11.
I was just going to say that. We were just talking about this at 9/11. Yeah.
Exactly. It was a superordinate identity. Suddenly, Democrat, Republican became less salient, and American became temporarily very salient.
It was.
People couldn't cooperate. And
it also strikes me to some extent similar to what Tom Nichols was talking about when he talked about, as he said, the paradox of, I don't know, I was talking about moving the Overton window of when you make things better and better, that you continue to just find your range of harms or your range of unhappiness, still, even though by the metrics, things have improved, everyone is less hungry. So then you start complaining about getting raw chicken in your salad instead of being grateful that you got chicken at all. And then, and so, yeah.
So I want to ask, I know you're not an evolutionary psychologist, but I want to ask why this is evolutionarily to our advantage. So we divide into teams naturally. The inclusive legal positivists and Scott and his minions go to war. Some of them end up getting killed. Why is this to the advantage of reproduction of the species?
Of legal positivists.
Right, the reds and
Fun.
blues. I mean,
This is the
why
self-help portion of the show.
why aren't we programmed to love the members of the other team and want to mate with them?
Oh, go ahead, Dominic.
I mean, I think what we argue anyway is that it's not that we're programmed to affiliate to any particular kind of group, but we certainly seem to be wired to be groupy. And I think it comes back to Scott's point about cooperation. It's that as soon as you think you're part of some group with other people, it forms a momentary solidarity that allows for collaboration, cooperation, and trust that's really hard without it. There are other ways to trust. So you can develop trust with someone by a long-term relationship, right? That you've got a record of their behavior. Sometimes we can trust people we don't know personally, but through reputation. But in groups, it's been called depersonalized trust, where it's, I trust you just because we're part of the same group, and I'm at least give you some latitude because of that, even though I don't know who you are. It sort of sets a foundation for us to form a relationship.
Well, also because there's a sense of accountability that you're in that group, and the group can hold you accountable for like some type of like speaks for you, or like, does that make sense?
That's right. Yeah, totally. So that's the sort of other side of group dynamics, which is we focus a lot on how we treat the out group, but we're just, and sometimes actually more harsh internally than we are externally, because we don't like deviants within our group who are violating our own norms. And we really often care very much about enforcing our standards for behavior, including, like, say, in the Greek chorus, right? Like, we don't accept certain kinds of action or activity, and we will crowd it out.
Have you been doing a social experiment with us with that one person that we're not going to name? Yeah.
We sure do not tolerate deviant behavior.
No, we don't. I do want to, I have a question. Well, I want to get to Genevieve's question, but I just want to say really that I think that there's also something to the evolutionary, like, I'm going to posit that there is, like, to follow up, that if you're talking about the multivalences of identity, and that you can have your ability to be chameleon-like and to identify or be taken in by like X number of groups, is like your chances of survival are greater as an individual if you can fit into all of these, like, as many groups as possible, right? So like, even though they might be going to war with each other, they like having multiple types of identities can.
So for the working title for our book for a long time was Social Chameleons.
Yeah.
So exactly that idea that we can change the color metaphorically of our skin. We can fit in with different categories of people to take advantage of the social opportunities that are out there. But there's always this duality of, when that's happening, it's helping you cooperate with some people, but unless it's like truly a global community, inherently it's excluding others. And often we enforce those boundaries quite rigorously for a bunch of reasons that we haven't talked about, but that are psychologically very meaningful for us.
Cool. GDF. Hi.
Heyo. Did you have one in particular that you were thinking of?
No, whatever you can do, all of them, one of them, whatever you want to do.
So I have a couple. The first one is, so leaders like President Biden and Pope Francis, for very different reasons, are often criticized by Catholics for not being Catholic enough. And is this a normative part of the process of fostering dissent and a signal of potentially changing norms? Or is this simply like a fixed lens that the members of that group have yet to question?
That's a great question.
Great question. Yeah, so we have a chapter on leadership, which is a super complicated dynamic, I think, in groups. But I think you're pointing to something we talk a lot about, which is, to have legitimacy, leaders have to be regarded as one of us. They have to be seen as part of the group and emblematic or exemplifying the group in some way. And for that reason, leadership is often a contest between different people who want to be the leader, and they've got somewhat different stories about who we are, and it's a battle for who has the most legitimacy in terms of their story. And so, yeah, in the case of Joe Biden, for example, is he a good enough Catholic? Is he really one of us, right? Or has he strayed too far beyond, Catholic doctrine that we can't accept him as a central member of our community and someone we would look to for leadership? And so leaders are often, that's really what they're trying to do, is exemplify that. Yeah, I really am one of us. And the term that so psychologists use is rather than saying typicality, like I'm one of us as I'm in the most modal, ordinary member of the group, they use the word prototypicality, sort of like we expect our leaders to exemplify us. Like
This is
they
like
may
Doug
have
Medine's experiments with the tree.
much like, yeah, exactly. So it's like we want them to be sort of super group members. Like they have our qualities taken to the next level. They're aspirational figures in a way. That's, at least those are the leaders we find most inspiring. And by we, I don't necessarily mean all people, right? So like Trump, I think, is actually a very powerful identity
I was going to
leader
say that.
because he exemplifies a certain American version of identity that 60+% of the country does not buy into at all and finds as obnoxious, but a bunch of people actually find very appealing.
So this kind of leads me to my second question, because when we're dealing with a leader and we're trying to understand their identity as that leader, how can we best weigh their authenticity versus a projection of that identity that they've adopted for utilitarian purposes?
That's a really good question too.
That's a really awesome question. I mean, I think it's something group members are like highly attuned to. We're always looking for hypocrisy and a sign that that it's fake, and inauthenticity. And
It's really about whether
and
you
it's like
can
the
beer
worst-
with them, GDF.
Right. Well, that's what that's all about, right? It's like, why do we care if they eat Philly cheesesteak or eat pizza with a knife and fork, or you could have a beer with them? It's that sense of authenticity, and most of them don't pull it off, right? Like Josh Hawley, for example, I find deeply inauthentic.
Scott identifies a lot with JD Vance.
Yeah, that guy, I feel like embodies YLS conservative.
A punchable face.
I mean, that's the thing is like what's so risible about people like JD Vance is the fact is that they're so inauthentic. I mean, that's what's hysterical about them, which is in a way, it's so ironic, of course, because he is so identified. I mean, the only reason why we would know his name is because he's responsible for this book, which identified a class of people in Hillbilly Elegy and gave he wouldn't exist without identity politics. So that's a strange thing.
It seems to me, though, that there's a difference between people who organically arise out of an identity movement and people who see the movement and glom onto it. I mean, whatever you say about Donald Trump, and I have certainly had my fair share to say about him, it seems to me he is not a J.D. Vance figure. He is somebody who hypothesized the existence of an identity he could form around himself, tested the hypothesis, and won. He's kind of an identity entrepreneur. J.D. Vance. Wow,
that's a great expression.
J.D. Vance
identity entrepreneur.
Saw the identity. Wow, there are these people around Trump, and said, I can do that. And of course, he actually can't. And Josh Hawley can raise his fist walking by, but nobody buys it, right? And it actually takes courage to be Donald Trump, to be an identity entrepreneur, because you might flop. And, if you walk down those, come down that escalator and people just giggle at you, then you're Herman Cain.
I mean, this is why he freaks out so much to all of like the kind of like the personal, like to the mocking and like attacks them so viscerally.
I think, but I think it's really important to distinguish between the people who are, authentically hypothesizing and testing an identity, and people who are just kind of Me Tooing an existing identity, maybe successfully like Ron DeSantis, semi-successfully, maybe unsuccessfully.
I think that's 100%
like
right.
J.D. Vance.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think Trump is deeply authentic. He's true to himself, and what he says is what he thinks, and it alienates a huge number of people, but it also resonates with a certain set. And so he's got that authenticity on his side. So the term identity entrepreneur is an awesome term. It was previously coined by two social psychologists, Alex Haslam and Steve Reichert.
I just want to say I made it up myself now, so I will not claim to have coined it, but I will have claimed to have authentically
thought of it independently.
Right.
I mean, it's an awesome term, and they have a piece for anyone who's interested in. I think it was Scientific American from a few years ago about Trump as a leader.
Wow, that's
where
cool.
I think they called him an identity entrepreneur. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to beg everyone's patience and ask one more, and then I'm going to vanish. But when you're dealing with, exactly, Ben, when you're dealing with competing ideologies, how can disparate social groups find common ground? And does it require both groups to hold that common goal? Or is there a way for them to come together in a, I don't want to say forced, but motivated fashion? Like, how do you motivate them to find that ground? And thank you very much.
Bye, GDF.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful question, and I don't actually have a great answer other than that. I think that's the central challenge, is to find. So we end the book by talking about future challenges where we think identity is a relevant issue. So climate change, can we rally some sort of global identity sufficiently to act on it? Inequality, especially in like the new gig economy where people are individual entrepreneurs ostensibly, right? So you're not a cab driver anymore, you're a rideshare guy who there's no collective there. Can they rally to seek good wages and things? And but we also have about democracy, right? So there's clearly anti-democratic forces at work which are pretty unified, or they're seeming to work together quite well. Can people who are pro-democracy, who have very different interests at times, but still need democracy to pursue those interests, can they put aside their differences? And I think it takes leadership. I think it takes people pointing out where there is solidarity and then helping people rally around that. Because I think we have a readiness to rally, but it's not easy to spot.
So can I ask a question about, like, so your book is called The Power of Us, right? Right. So
Yep.
So like the idea is like, don't be afraid of us versus them. But and there's the problem is that us and them often leads to friend and enemy. And actually,
Right.
Schmidt thought that like the most important social group, the political group, was the people you're willing to kill for and the people you're willing to die for. And so the question is how, like, I'm sure you've thought about it, obviously, and you've described the book so, it sounds so interesting. I'm definitely ordering it right after I get off this. But how do we stop us versus them from becoming friend versus enemy?
Yeah, I think there's always this duality of groups, and these social identities give us a lot of positive things, but they come with these negative consequences. And what we're hoping to do in the book is help people take charge of that let's try to capitalize on the good things that come along with these things, but be aware of the potential for the negatives. And one of the things we argue very strongly that any sense that what is often called tribalism, which isn't a term I like, but this sort of sense it's inevitable that you discriminate and hate and dislike other people, it's not inevitable. That's not built in. Groupiness is, but the strong toxic sort of dynamic isn't. And what is well established, but is really not well understood, is that the way group members behave is they follow norms. The more you feel part of a group, the more you follow that group's norms. And groups can develop very toxic norms where they suppress all dissent, where they spread disinformation, where they hate the other group. But groups can also develop inclusive norms where they value other people, where their whole mission is actually to help others, people different from themselves. I think about like a lot of charitable organizations, right? It's about helping others who are not part of our group, and that becomes normative. So I've said normative many times. Hopefully everyone's drunk. But fundamentally, we think that's where the action is.
I mean, one of the things that kind of where all of this, and some of the sociological and the psychology come into policy and the law, it's like one of the things that Robert Post has written about really extensively, which I think is wonderful, is about how there is no such thing as community without a set of shared norms. Like, it's really not just a labeling thing. And that unless you do have kind of like collective like ideas around it. So I want to really before there's a poll up so everyone can vote on that. And then I just wanted to kind of close it. Also, I love how everything in social psychology is so nested, and like the things of identity are like run into like questions of authenticity, and then like questions of, categorizations, and then questions of, like the typicality or prototypicality. So the Doug Medine study that I talked about, I think I've talked about on the show before, but it's the study of experts being able to basically sort prototypicality. And they did it with trees. So they did like landscapers, like people who worked with trees, and they like surveyed them to ask what their prototypical tree was. And like lay people, and I forget what the exact groupings were, but like across all categories, even experts, there was a prototypical tree that was a complete fictional tree, a super tree. Like the prototypical tree was like a giant tree that was both like deciduous and coniferous, and like there was not like a, so I think that that's actually like, maybe we're just all stuck with like these kind of like identity entrepreneurs finding out how to be that like mutant tree that is like taps into like something really essential that we want, like, and that we like, that like taps into all of our different like kind of like identities and our plays on our empathy in that way. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So just to spin off that briefly. So I got contacted by USA Today, I think last week, because I don't know if you remember, but at a rally maybe last Monday, Trump endorsed the vaccine. He told the crowd, you should get vaccinated, and he got booed and jeered. And so their question was why? And our answer is that identity leadership, like being that prototypic tree, is a double-edged sword. Like on the one hand, it's given him tremendous influence because he's regarded as one of us. But he's
on the other hand, you have nobody to mate with. Sorry, no, that's not what you're saying.
A good thing, but yeah, he's locked into it as well. So there are limits on, if you define us as like, we don't believe in the vaccine, then you can't stray too far beyond that before it's like, wait, maybe you aren't one of us. Maybe you shouldn't be leading us, and you get booed and jeered. And so in that case, you're going to see the group leading him, right, where they're pushing back, and I doubt he'll speak much about it again, which is a shame because I think he would save a lot of lives if he would actually stand up there.
Well, I just want to say that we posed in the poll whether Crowdcast in lieu of fun should wage war on YouTube in lieu of fun. 80% of you voted no. I am going to be an identity entrepreneur here and say, let's get the bastards. If they won't come over to Crowdcast.
You also wanted to fight, you keep trying to fight Putin. So like,
yeah, well, but I don't ask for for people to form an identity around that. But I'm saying we, the few, the Crowdcast people, should have identity pride in watching authentic in lieu of fun on Crowdcast with the Greek chorus, and we should be prepared to rumble with the
rumble
non-authentic YouTube posers. And if you're one of those YouTube posers, we're coming for you.
No, thank you.
I just say I voted no.
I'm a conscientious objector. I can't vote.
I'm a believer in the Kellogg-Briand Pact. I do not. I outlaw
like a
war.
cereal thing?
What?
Is that like?
Yeah, that's the cereal thing. Exactly. Yeah.
Beyond Industries.
Anyways, man, no one likes my really bad jokes about international law. Okay, anyway, I'll just keep making jokes about trees and chickens.
And yet you wanted to pull together some International Law Week or something.
I know. We're going to talk about that. Dominic, please come back again. Join us forever in the Crowdcast world. This was really great. And also just I'd love to hear about your research generally when you're not writing a book with Jay. And I'd also love to hear more stories about Jay. He sounds
and more raw chicken.
Yeah, more raw chicken.
And vomiting and choking and Heimlich maneuver stuff. We don't have enough vomiting on In Lieu of Fun.
We will be back. What is it, 23? What is the count? How did it get? 22 hours and 56 minutes from now. I'm sorry. And
are we going to have a guest tomorrow?
Oh yeah, and we're gonna. But sometimes we don't. We don't always do. Anyways, we have a guest.
But when we
Alexandra Brodsky is going to be talking about her book Sexual Justice, which I think will be very interesting, and she will be back 22 hours and 55 minutes from now. And until then, Ben,
we don't have fun anymore. And if we're lucky, we don't have raw chicken either, but some of us do.
Dominic, it was a pleasure. The link to his book is in the chat.
You stepped on the line, Ben. You had the perfect line.
What was it?
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have us.
Oh, good point.
That would have been
Yeah.
Yeah, you're out of the group, Ben.
You're right.